Thank you for joining us for this conversation about Indigenous women's resistance to extractive industries. I'm Yifat Suskind. I'm the Executive Director of MADRE, and we are an international women's rights organization working in support of grassroots women's groups facing wars and environmental disasters. And in recent years, our Indigenous partners have been sounding an alarm about a new wave of violent resource extraction on their territories. Extractions of fossil fuels, of minerals, of water, of timber, of the land itself. And we understand that much of the Earth's remaining natural resources are now located on these Indigenous territories for the pretty alarming reason that in the other parts of the world, they have already been exhausted. The parts of the world where Indigenous peoples have not been present, sustainably stewarding the Earth's natural resources. And in many places in the world, it's Indigenous women who are on the forefront of confronting and battling these extractive industries. And in doing that, they have been not only defending their own territories, but in many cases defending the life support systems of the planet itself on behalf of all of us. We know that we're reaching a kind of tipping point of environmental destruction from extractive industries, from species depletion, from climate change. But it's also true that we are reaching another tipping point that's much more hopeful, because more and more people around the world are realizing what Indigenous women have always taught. One, that we have to overcome the dangerous fallacy of chasing after limitless economic growth on a limited planet. And two, that extractivism is a lot more than just an economic process. Extractivism is a worldview. It's a worldview that looks out at the earth and sees property and profits instead of a living entity that includes all of us. And that was a message that was delivered by an international delegation of Indigenous women that visited the fracking fields of North Dakota just a few days ago. A delegation organized by the Indigenous Environmental Network and MADRE that included women from 6 countries representing Africa and the Middle East and Asia and Latin America, that really witnessed the devastation and the environmental racism that's occurring right now in North Dakota. And our speakers today, Lucy Mulenki and Ariel Deranger, are women who are very well acquainted with that devastation, not just in North Dakota, but in their own territories and around the world, and have been leaders in the worldwide Indigenous women's struggles, Indigenous people's struggles against extractive industries and for the alternatives that we all need. So I'm going to formally introduce them and we'll have a bit of a discussion. And thanks again for joining us. Lucy Mulenki is here from Kenya. She is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Information Network, a member of the Maasai people. Lucy has been both the chairperson and coordinator of the African Indigenous Women Organization in the East African region. She is the co-founder and co-chair of the Indigenous Women Biodiversity Network and an active member of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And Ariel Deranger is a Dene member of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and executive director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action. Prior to this, Ariel worked with her First Nation to build out the International Indigenous Tar Sands campaign, challenging the expansion of Alberta's tar sands. She's recognized for her role in springboarding one of the first internationally recognized Indigenous rights-based divestment movements, and working to develop and lead mobilizations highlighting the impacts of the fossil fuel industry and climate change on the rights of Indigenous peoples. I want to thank you both very much for joining us for the conversation, and start out by asking you, Lucy, how extractive industries have impacted your communities.
Thank you very much, and it's great that we are here during the UN Permanent Forum discussing about extractive industries and looking at how our environment has been damaged by different development activities which are impact on us and also impact on our lands and our communities. And here we are discussing about traditional knowledge, which is very much related to what we are discussing about. And extractive industries really impact indigenous women in different ways, and depending on the land where you come from. For example, in Africa, we've had a lot of small-scale mining, which has been a bigger problem. We also have now oil extraction in some of the areas also in Kenya, where some of the pastoralists are. And one of the biggest things that makes these to impact on the indigenous women and indigenous people as a whole is because they never understand about that development that is coming. It's brought to their land because, as you already indicated in your introduction, how large-scale programs, projects can really impact on people's lives. And most of the governments don't even inform that these projects are going to impact us like this and like that. And most of the indigenous people, they see a development coming, the elders are told you have to give this part of land to do this, just as what we saw in North Dakota, and they could agree, but at the end of the day, they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And tomorrow becomes one of the worst things because, for example, in small-scale mining, they use chemicals like mercury. They don't know how that impacts on them. And you find a mother, she's already taken a small territory there. She's mining using all those chemicals. She's right there in the middle of trying to get the gold. At the same time, she has people helping her, and the children are there. And she will move out of there and walk into the house, or even walk outside there and breastfeed the baby, not knowing what is going to happen to her. So it impacts both on our lives, our health, and even the health of a larger community, because of the runoffs go to the rivers, and the whole chemicals go to the river, they get into our water bodies. So it becomes a kind of a circle going round and round. What we saw in North Dakota was really very surprising and very shocking, that every piece of land we saw that there was already oil mining, and the communities are in the same place. Mm-hmm. And there is dumping in the same place at the same time. So at the end of the day, you wonder, do these people and do even the government think about the health of these communities? Do they think of the future? Is it a way of trying to look at these communities as they should not even live more than 50 years, It really is something that is very worrying. And that's why indigenous people come out always and, try as much as possible to try and bring that, information to their own people, so that at least they can be aware of the dangers. So I think this is something that I want to bring up. And for example, in Kenya, as I mentioned, there's also like in Nigeria, in Africa, where we have had communities suffering and dying because of oil exploration and oil mining in that country. Right now in Kenya is going to be the same. There is also some other extractive industries that are large dams, which come and destroy the whole place. They take the waters that is supposed to go holistically to the rivers, and the large dams are used by other people. We also saw that in Dakota. We also saw that also issues like logging, where people normally don't think like logging is a big industry. It's a big industry, and it destroys our environment. It cuts off all that's why we're having climate change every other time. Long, prolonged droughts for us. When the rains come, they come with floods, and there we are. We keep suffering.
Right. Yeah. And what about in your communities, Ariel? How would you talk about some of the impacts?
I mean, I don't think there's really any difference between what's happening in Kenya, what's happening in North Dakota, what's happening in Alberta, in my people's territory in Treaty 8. In Treaty 8, it's the same thing, and it's not just one industry. Alberta and Treaty 8, my people's territory, has been known as the tar sands extraction zone. And what we've seen is all of those impacts, from environmental, socioeconomical, the impacts on the safety and security of women in our community, where we now have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, experiencing these things firsthand. Like, I don't feel safe in my own community anymore because we have so many outsiders coming in, and with all of these workers that are male-dominated working industry, we have this influx of people that are not from the region. They don't care about our lands. They have no regard for our culture, our people. And as an Indigenous woman, they look at us as just, they're just there, like we're nobody. And I have been mistaken for no reason other than being an Indigenous woman as being a prostitute in my own territory. And these are things that we experience, and the socioeconomic impacts are so perverse because it's not just about this industry coming in and making false promises and telling our communities, oh, we're just going to take a little bit, and then the impacts end up way down the road. We find out that it's much worse. We have dumping into our river systems, our landscapes have become toxic wastelands, our animals are disappearing, our food security, all of those things. But beyond those environmental impacts which affect our culture, we also have the fact that we are now economic hostages in our territories, where for decades these extractive industries have inflated our economic systems, where we are now reliant, because our food security is gone, that if we want to feed our families, we want to pay the bills and put a roof over our head, you have to be employed in the very sector that is destroying and is complicit in destroying your rights and sacrificing. We are sacrifice zones in our own territories. Indigenous peoples have become the sacrifice so that people can continue business as usual, so that the current economic systems can continue with their infinite 3% annual growth. And it's just absolutely become so perverse that it's become impossible to unhinge those sort of tentacles of this economic paradigm that is pitting our culture against progress. And I think in the climate crisis, what we're starting to see is that the so-called progress, the so-called development, is actually the wrong way. The Alberta tar sands is the fastest growing sector of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. And it's our communities that are feeling the impacts of climate change. It's our communities that are feeling those impacts, and it's our communities that are going to lead the way. And the last point that I want to make on the economic part is that our community has had millions and billions, if not trillions of dollars extracted, not just from tar sands, but mega hydro on the west side of us, uranium mining on the east side of us, diamond mining to the north of us, and tar sands to the south of us. And so billions of dollars have been extracted from our territories. And our community uses diesel tanks to heat our homes, where we pay exorbitant prices just to heat our homes in our community. We pay exorbitant prices until recently. A gallon of milk cost $18. A loaf of Wonder Bread at the grocery store was $8. Produce was basically non-existent and overpriced. And so we are economic hostages, and there are people making billions of dollars off of our backs.
And I think if I just to add a little bit, when development comes to an area already, and that's why you find even some communities who decide they are going to be self-isolated, the moment they make the road, you find there are newcomers coming in, big lorries, which becomes a culture shock for the people. And already you start having, and of course the foreign people who come in, who are driving those cars and who are managing those, do not understand the communities, do not know their cultures, and already life becomes disrupted completely. People start losing their traditional knowledge because they are moving, they are being moved left and right. The sacred sites are also impacted on, like what we even saw in Dakota, that they no longer have special places where they normally go. There is no place you can go anymore to collect any traditional medicine or traditional plants. We didn't see any single green, a small garden or anything that somebody can walk in. All throughout, we either saw oil or we saw already where the wheat farms and the barley farms have been harvested. So it really tells you that already when development comes, it changes the whole ecosystem, the whole community, and the whole life of the people. And automatically they even start losing land. Some of the cultures start disappearing. You have, if it is in Africa, we have children dropping out of school, young girls. We have women also being disrupted. Some of the young women, as you know, most of the communities are polygamist and so on. They start now moving and disrupting the whole family. So this is something that is very crucial for governments and private sector to also try to understand the communities before they come into any, or before they decide to undertake any development in the area.
I think even adding on to that is like, they talk about, oh, well, we consulted, we talked with the communities, we said these things, but maybe we all speak a common language, but I think our understanding and nuances and our value systems are very, very different. When you have all these big lorry trucks, or we call them semi-trucks, coming in and this new culture coming in, when they come in and they say, oh, we're gonna help you prosper. What is prosperity to an Indigenous person versus a corporation? And I think there's that almost like we're speaking a different language. We might be saying the same words and we might understand our words, but our value systems are so different. And one of the things that I think is a really interesting story from my territory is that our people are subsistence, hunter-gatherer. And so we don't cultivate. And so having an intact ecosystem is critically important for our people. And we survived as subsistence living. 80% of our food was subsistence until 20 years ago when the tar sands started to expand and triple and double annually. And so as we saw this expansion happen, we saw the decrease in our food systems. But it's not just that from contamination. We have a bison herd, like buffalo, bison herd in our territory. And the government declared it a diseased herd, and so they have no protective measures. So now white hunters, like people that from not our territory, are coming in and they see bison as a trophy animal. And they go out and they hunt these bison, the last remaining of this herd that's very culturally significant to our people, just to cut their heads off, to have as a trophy. And 3 years ago, we had hunters that were tracking for 3 days, these bison. And when they finally found them, they found 3 beheaded bison. The meat had been too long out in the wild, and so it had gone bad. And they lost enough meat to feed like 10 families in our communities because of the values and the cultural differences of the disrespect of the way that we happened to live our lives before they came into our territory. So it's not just about, environment, it's not just about those things, it's about a disruption, as you said, to the very ways in which we live.
And I think both of you are pointing to the really, really urgent need to redefine what progress is and what that looks like from the perspective of people who know how to do what so desperately needs to be done now worldwide, which is to live in balance and sustainably with the earth and with the natural resources that we still have remaining. I know both of you are social movement leaders and have traveled a lot in solidarity with people in other territories. I would love to hear you speak a little bit about how your experiences visiting other territories has shaped your perspectives on the work.
I think it has shaped in that when I look at what happens in other countries or in other areas or in other communities, it now brings you back again to start thinking of what strategies you can take in order to change what you've seen. What do you tell your colleagues that you've gone to visit? What strategy can they use? We've seen that in most of Indigenous people's land and in different areas. We've definitely seen that it's all related, as she says, from another continent to another. There's definitely a problem of institutions, traditional institutions. Those ones have broken down. And those institutions need to be put back to where they are. Going to North Dakota, we heard of how some of those leaders were able to sign off their land, were able to give a consent to their lands or to have development in the area. But when you look at that and you also look at the other areas where some communities, even like the Maasai or other pastoralists, have sold their land, is almost similar to that. They don't look at the value and look at what is there tomorrow. And the government and the private sector know how to play cards with them. They would come there with everything and buy them off. So it's really changed to look at, to tell the community that don't look at what you think is money for now. Look at beyond that. Let's look at these generations who are coming. Maybe for us, we have heard and we've seen life the way it is, but where are your children going to live? Where are they going to live? Are they going to live in the streets or in the concrete flats in different towns? You have to look at beyond that. And that has made us also look at other issues of trying to see how you can negotiate with those local governments from the local level, looking at the different structures you have. And I always like to advise the communities that start from the local leader, like what in the US, I think they call them sheriffs or whatever they call them, the chief, as we call them our local chiefs, and then we go to the county, sub-county and local county, and then we move on up, so that we see whether we can be able to change. I think the other powerful thing is to ensure that you empower especially women, so that they can have a voice, so that they can be able to really know their rights and be able to speak for the rights of all the people, because women have got a powerful voice. If they come out of town and start screaming and demanding some things, somebody will have to stop and listen. And like a man, they will think, oh, these guys are drunk or something. But for a woman, somebody will stand and say, what are they talking about? What's happening today? Why are they all in town? So you have to have strategies. And the strategies for us in Africa, we decided and we learned from what we saw from the others, is to make sure you empower the women. Mm-hmm. You really make sure that they know their issues. Make sure that they understand why. In most of the constitutions, they say women can own land. Most of them it's not practiced. Mm-hmm. But now we are even teaching the women to know the land laws. They have to know the land laws through our partners. We teach them this is the land laws. Some of them didn't even know how a land title deed looks like. They have to be taught how it looks like, how it's written, and what are the consequences if you lose it, and so on, so that they can go and demand. Otherwise, if you don't teach them and they don't know, then they don't know their rights, they are not aware of anything, they will be the ones to always get problems. And when the government and administration sees that the women are aware and communities are aware, they start thinking twice. These people really know what they're talking about.
Yes. I mean, all of that, and I think for myself, like, knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is really, really powerful. And not just knowledge and understanding of the colonial systems that have been imposed on our people, but one of the things that I feel like I've really been privileged to have experienced and to have laid witness to is sharing of the knowledge and the strategies with other Indigenous peoples. And there's something that's really powerful in recognizing that your fight isn't just yours alone in your own community. As Indigenous peoples, colonization in the Americas has been over 500 years. Many of our people have been diminished in populations quite significantly. My community is only about 1,200 people, which isn't a lot. But when you recognize that our struggle is your struggle, is the struggles of other people, it becomes very powerful to see those interconnections that we have that exist between us. And that cosmology that has been demonized through Catholicism and systems of white supremacy is actually something that exists internationally more so than other sort of imposed religions in our territories. And that interconnectedness with the natural world is something that's so important. And what's really interesting is that when you get down to it, in the roots of so many of Indigenous communities, women are the center. And you start to see that power, and it's such a beautiful and empowering thing. But I think one of the most striking things for me in lessons that I've learned is that when I was in Ecuador just recently, I got to attend the Waroni people's court hearings when they were challenging the leasing of their territory by the Ecuadorian government to oil and gas companies. And they were challenging just the leases. So there's no development. It's just the leases, so these companies can come explore to see if there is anything worth value in their territories. And the government in Ecuador has apparently upheld sort of tenets of free, prior, and informed consent. But what happened was these people said, we didn't understand what you were asking us for. And this is a tribe that has only been contacted in 1960. So 1960. And so I started thinking about that. So in 1960 is when they started consulting, or when they started developing the Alberta tar sands. 1960 is the year that they were first contacted. Yet we are still dealing with the exact same problems. And I started to recognize that time, as far as like the way in which we've treated Indigenous peoples, has not changed. It can be 1880, or it can be 1960, or it can be 2019. And those same policies of the oppressive nature to subdue Indigenous cosmology and values, to minimize its importance, is still true as it was, hundreds of years ago. We talk about it. We talk about it a lot in these spaces, like the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, but we still are not seeing governments actualize the real recognition of the rights of our communities. And what's so powerful, though, is that our communities are rising up across the globe, and we're starting to make those connections across oceans, across borders, and that's what's been so powerful.
And I think it's very important now that you brought the issue of governments. It's a high time they implement these laws that they have, because most of those laws are just lying out somewhere.
Right.
Even those who have already ratified and signed the Declaration of Indigenous People, it's just there.
Yeah.
But we need action. We need action. And that's why communities have come with many concepts which have grown up and up and down, issues of environmental justice, because they feel that something has to be done, And some of the laws, even down in the countries, they are very important laws that are there, but the governments are not simply implementing them. They make lots of regulations. I can't tell you, if you go to every country, if they have to put their laws in the library, maybe even the biggest room you have cannot fit.
Right.
But there is never implemented. There is never an effort to pick that and teach the community. It's just somewhere there.
Yeah, I think that one of the most powerful interventions that you and the hundreds of other Indigenous women who are here at the United Nations this week are doing is that, demanding not just new laws, new language, but implementation and equitable implementation that is interpreted by Indigenous peoples themselves is what's needed. And also making the connections that are so powerful between what women on the ground are experiencing and analyzing and demanding as solutions, and what governments are doing in these international spaces, and making that relevant and accountable to the women in your communities.
I think it needs to go further than that, though. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was the first convention to be written with the participation of Indigenous peoples. The problem is that our governments, like state governments, are creating all sorts of laws and legislation without our participation. And then it becomes a burden and an onus on our communities to interpret that, to understand it, to teach it to our people. We don't have access to information that is accessible to us. Like, it's not accessible information. Hundreds and thousands of documents inside, legislative systems that aren't even accessible in our own languages, accessible in our own understandings and cosmology. Like, we need to, full stop, we need to be thinking about how we're continuing to make new laws and legislation without the participation of Indigenous peoples that are supposed to protect us as well. And so, it's backwards. We need to be reframing our value systems to include Indigenous values in the development of new policies. It needs to go beyond just making them accessible in our language. It needs to be making those new laws and policies in participation and in collaboration with our people.
In the 80s, the United Nations Environment Program Executive Secretary by then, the late Mustafa Tolfan, God rest his soul in peace, he talked about climate change in the 83, 84, and he talked about the ozone layer heating up because of the industrial activities and all those fluorocarbon, whatever they call them. Nobody listened to him. And he brought it every other year and every other time at the United Nations Environment Program, which is based in Nairobi. People just kept quiet and just overlooked that. Today, what is impacting on us? Now, from I think a few years ago, there came the green economy, there has come a blue economy. What else has come? There are quite a number of other concepts that have come up. In the next 20 years, 30 years, what will happen again? The governments have really to be very serious, because they are the ones who hold the whole law. They are the ones who have to say yes and no to laws. We as civil society, we can do as much, but there are some limits. Sometimes we cannot go beyond. And that's why we come here every other year. We come and urge the parties to the conventions, different conventions, governments to try and implement and take action. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. Next year, 2020, will be another milestone for many activities that are happening, not only to the environment, but to social, to women's rights, and to everything. We want to see what will happen. You see, so we really have to move on and really make sure we make an effort, and we hope they will listen to us. I don't know, but it's really an issue that we need to really take up very seriously. And the moment we talk about all these other issues, they are all connected. Biodiversity is lost. Indigenous people lose their lands and traditions and language and everything. They become desperate. They start moving from rural areas to towns to look for greener pastures. They leave the rest of the family desperate in the community. We find that also because of climate change, the logging and so on. Nobody is trying to put back the land together. It's impacting on the people. It continues. Right now in Kenya, most of the rivers are dry. Even Masai Mara River, which is a river which is very holding the whole of the ecosystem, because simply of the destruction in Mau Forest. And when the communities talk about it, and when NGOs and civil society try to look at it, politicians are not listening. So the lawmakers have to wake up. I think they have to wake up from another side of the bed one morning and change the laws as much and implement them as much as possible.
Yes.
Thank you.
So both of you are pointing to a number of different strategies. So this kind of legal advocacy that needs to happen, the kind of education of community members so that they can be empowered to do the advocacy, women's rights as a strategy, shifting an analysis to be able to see all of these interconnections that you just named, changing the narrative about values and progress in the way that you were describing, Ariel. What are other sort of strategies that you feel like are critical right now and that people might be able to support?
I think first off, we really need to be looking at how we can create strategies in our local territories and regions that are empowering the communities, empowering the base. We spend a lot of time trying to change the minds of people in power. All the time. We're like constantly rushing around. How do we change the mind of this politician or this person or that person? And what ends up happening is we end up spending too much of our resources doing that and not ensuring that our communities aren't having to move to the urban centers to find greener pastures. So how do we focus on supporting the resiliency of our communities to have that base? So when those companies or those governments come in with their trinkets and baubles, as my chief once called it, and these empty promises of prosperity, that they understand, that they know what's happening. And the most vulnerable populations in most of our, if not all of our communities, are women and girls. And so how do we work to empower women and girls in our communities to understand not only that they have a voice, but that they have rights, that they have the ability to step in and stand up and be respected? And I think that colonization and the imposition of patriarchy has a really long legacy in Canada and in North America and all over the world. And so that is a really, really important avenue in which we must go down, is working from the grassroots, working from the base, and really trying to change the understanding that we don't have to abide by those laws. We don't have to, take this prescribed economies in our territories. We don't have to do those things. That we have models for alternatives that are just as valuable, just as important, particularly in a time of climate crisis. Our land stewardships, our relationships with nature are so valuable and so critical to developing the pathways forward for future generations.
Yeah, I think you've said everything. And to me, even going to the grassroots is also, we have to start probably having another strategy of beginning working with the children, so that the children can harass anybody around if they mess up with the environment. And we go back to the sayings that we have, the little things that we do. Wangari Maathai, the late professor, used to say the little things that you do really makes a big difference. So maybe we have to go back to the roots and try to see what can we really do to make changes? What can we really do to change the minds of these people? But I think she's put it pretty right, and I don't have to repeat it. Thank you.
Yes, I would agree. And I just want to ask if you have any final comments that you'd like to share, both of you.
I I think for me, I want to say that everything is connected. There is nothing that is separate from the other. Even the water we drink, if we pollute it, if we do those industrial development, we'll also be polluting water. But the most important thing is that we are not, indigenous people are not saying development is wrong. Development is a must and it can happen. But there is one important thing she said, consultation, pure informed consent. Let the people know. Let the people also give ideas so that we talk with you, and if this thing goes back, we are both to blame and not to blame one person. So that's why it's very, very important to make sure that we are all together, but not only one person doing one thing. I think it's very, very crucial to remember that.
Yeah, I think that this idea of power over rather than power with, and I think for a lot of our communities, absolutely, we're not against development. You know, a lot of us like Facebook and having cell phones and being a part of the modern world, and I don't think that we're saying in my country we get told all the time, oh, you want to go live back in teepees and have nothing and live in the mud? And I'm like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that we have the right to be equal participants in how we move forward, and I think that's super critical. And like for me, I think about how short of a timeline we've really damaged this planet, and how short of a timeline we've really messed things up. And there are still indigenous peoples, and there are still people really advocating for the real change necessary. I'm the first generation in my family to not be forced into a residential school. I'm the first generation in my family to not have my language as my first language, as like Dene Sotane as my first language. I'm the first generation in my family to not live on the land. And the only reason I don't live on the land, and I don't have all of that, is because a uranium mining company displaced my family when my mom was 9 months pregnant with me. My sister was born on the land. And so you think about the legacy of colonization, and we think of it something that happened a long time ago, and we should just get over it and join the rest of society and stop complaining and asking for special rights. But the reality is we're not asking for something special. We're asking for recognition of something that exists right now. And that we want to be equal partners, as you said, in determining the future for our own communities in partnership with the rest of the world.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank you both for your work, for your brilliant analysis, for sharing it with us, and thank you all for joining the conversations.